Let's get started. Okay, if you really want to know where we're at, we're on F, the ministry of gentleness. Well, we're having all new notes, because this is my new notes.
We're putting your new notes on old paper.
And well, if I had time, I would rewrite the whole book again. And as I just kept reading this week, and in fact, I finished it this morning because I preached last night. And so as I was finishing, the whole book, once you get the whole book, it all tied together. Because there's three things that are key to a move of God from our perspective. The character of the people that are ministering. The ministries that are involved. And the participation of everybody out there. It takes all three. And it's key to the whole way. Once you put the whole book together, and we'll go back, and then the whole book, It's Time for God to Move, is based on those three things, the whole way through the book. And so as I was reading this, Paul says, and again, we'll just start at verse 1 real quick, and then I'm going to spend the rest of the time on 7, 8, and 9. Paul says, "For yourselves, brethren, know our entrance in unto you, that it was not in vain." That this was not a worthless, empty, purposeless service. There was a purpose for this service. There were things that happened every time Paul gathered. Every time Paul preached the gospel, there were things that happened. And then between verses 2 and verses 6, Paul describes the heart of the ministers in various ways, but he describes the heart of the minister. And he said, number one, again, verses 2 to 5, that a minister must have fidelity. He must be honest. He must be truthful. He must have integrity. He must not only say the right things, but more important, he must live the right things. Mm-hmm. And I went through, and I got to verse 11, because that's all the further I got studying over again. Starting at chapter 1, verse 1, and going to chapter 2, verse 11, you need to read, and you need to recognize how many times Paul says, in one form or another, well, let me just give them to you. In verse 5, he says, as you know. Chapter 1, verse 5. As you know. Why? Because here is Paul, and he's reminding the church that they were witnesses. They knew. They were examining his life. And he says, as you know. Look at verse 5 of chapter 2. He says this, verse 5, chapter 2, right in the middle. As you know. But not only do you know the character of our heart, God knows the character of our heart. In fact, Paul says, we are living in such a way that we'll call God the witness on our behalf. That what we're doing is done the right way for all the right purposes, regardless of what everybody else is saying. All right? Look at verse 9. Paul says this, you remember. Remember how we acted. Remember what we did. Remember our character. Verse 10, you are witnesses and God also. Not only did you look at us and watch us, that we spoke and we lived exactly the same thing. They were one in the thing, like Pastor Jim said this morning. And then verse 10 or 11, as you know. So Paul says here, the reason that the church was successful, the reason that something happened in ministry every time they met together was because the minister's character. He didn't say one thing and live something else. He wasn't a Pharisee. Remember, Jesus told the church, do what the Pharisees tell you, just don't live like the Pharisees. Because the two contradict each other. But Paul said over and over again, follow me as I follow Christ. Over and over again. Paul said, follow us as we follow Christ. Why? Because Paul knew that character is more important than what you say, because character will cancel out what you speak. You can say all the right words, but if you're not living the right life, forget it. Who cares? Who cares? The Pharisees said all the right things, but their life canceled it out. They really didn't believe it. They were just speaking it. Then, Paul said, the second characteristic of a minister is that he is disinterested in fame and power. He has no appetite for personal gain. Why? As we shared last night, it's all God's grace. We stand here because of God's grace. Everything that happens is because of God's grace. It's not because of anything else we've done. And so Paul, over and over again, because you know why? Because even in Paul's day, just like today, there were ministers who were preaching for all the wrong reasons. And people were telling them that, be careful, they're charlatans. They have ulterior motives. They only want your money. They're only after your money. And we need to be careful, because guess what? They're on television now. They're only after your money. They're only after what you can give them. They don't care about anything else. And then the third thing that Paul says the character of a minister is verse 6. A minister is humble. He's humble. Every minister must be humble. Does not strive for fame or popularity, points everyone to Jesus all the time. That's verse 6. And we see the character in those verses, in those three things. But then starting at verse 7, Paul begins to bring out the ministry, two aspects of the ministry. Not only were the ministers right with God, but the character of ministry. And he uses two examples, and we're going to cover one today. And it's the ministry of gentleness. Gentleness. And next week we're going to cover the ministry of training. And he uses two examples. He uses a nurse, a mother, and a father as two examples of a ministry. And then he covered one earlier, the ministry of a steward. That what we have, we received from God. We're just stewards. God's over here, you're over here, and ministers are in the middle. And all we do is take from here, pass through here, and give it over here. That's the ministry. That's what it's about. Do you understand? That's what tithing, and that's what giving, and that's what all that other stuff is. It all belongs to God. None of it. You know, we say 10% belongs to God and 90% is mine. No, God says I own it all. I own it all. All that you have is mine. He just allows us to keep 90%. Well, what are you doing with 90%? And so we see here in these verses, let me read them to you, and then I will give you all the characteristics of a gentle ministry. Because a ministry needs to be gentle. It needs to know when to be gentle. It needs to know when to be firm. It needs to know when to use mildness and when to be bold and correct. And it has to have both characteristics. So verse 7, Paul says this, "But we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. So being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because you were dear unto us. For you remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring day and night, because we would not be chargeable unto you, we preached unto you the gospel of God." Now, what are the characteristics of a nurse ministry? Because Paul says, just like a nurse. Number one, the heart of the ministry. The heart of the ministry, Paul, it opens up right at the very beginning. We were gentle. See, there are some people that you just got to know. Okay, next week when we get to the other aspect of ministry, ministry is based on individuality. You got to know how to minister to individuals, because you can't minister to everybody the same way. Because people are individuality. They're individuals. Even as we talked about grace last night. 7+ billion people on the face of this earth. How many billions of people from the beginning till now? And guess what? Every single one of them absolutely different. No two people are exactly the same. Just like snowflakes. And you can't minister to them the same way. And Paul later on says, we minister to every one of you individually based on what you could handle. So number one characteristic of a ministry that really truly impacts society is the heart of the ministry is in this aspect, we got to learn to be gentle. There are times when you got to be stern, even with children. You got to know when to be stern and when to be gentle. You got to know when to use the rod and when to just speak. All right? So number one characteristic, the heart of the ministry, gentleness. Number two, the place of ministry. Oh, I love this. Among you. Among you. You think, well, that's not really good. Oh, yeah, that is, because where were they? Right in the middle of all kind of trouble. You see, we want to minister when everything's going good. We want to minister when everything is just hunky-dory and the sun is shining and we want that mountaintop experience. But Paul said, no, the place of ministry is where the people are. Where's the people? Well, anywhere. Wherever they're at. They don't have to get right in order for you to minister to them. They will only get right if you minister to them. So wherever they're at. Look what Paul was dealing with. Who were they? They were idolaters. They had a house full of idols. They were prostitutes. They were drunkards. They were every foul thing. Thessalonica was an absolute terrible city. And Paul went there and with Silvanus and Timothy started a church. They weren't perfect, but they got to be the church that was known throughout the known world at that time because Paul knew that the place of ministry was right where people were. right where they were. He didn't expect them to get better. He didn't expect them to be perfect. He didn't expect them to have all their T's crossed and I's dotted and have everything right in their life, because if they had everything right in their lives, they didn't need Paul. And they didn't need Jesus. And we just slough over among you. No, where was Paul? Paul was right in the middle of that. Look, I mean, what was the biggest complaint about Jesus? He sits and eats with sinners. Well, what did he come to do? He came to seek and save that which was lost. Sinners, harlots, prostitutes, drunkards, stealers, gamblers, murderers. And we think that we need to be up somewhere, out somewhere, and not among the people. No, we need to be among the people. Right where the people are. And guess what? We're going to find out as you go down the road a little bit, you're going to get dirty. Because not everybody's going to smell good. And not everybody's going to be clean. You're going to get your hands dirty. And you're going to find out as we go down a little bit further that ministry is work. And if you're not willing to work, don't even think about going into the ministry. Heard Dr. Jeremiah preach a couple of weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. But anyways, the size of his ministry is, I can't even begin to imagine. Because he never mentions the size of his ministry. Now, Robert Morris mentioned the size of his ministry. He has 39,000 people. His church went from nothing to 39,000 people, members, in 20 years, and he has 360 staff that he oversees, plus chancellor of a Bible college. But Dr. Jeremiah said they get countless every week applications to come into the ministry. And he said they bring them in, not him, but whoever does it. I mean, they have people. And they bring them in, and he's trained them. Are you willing to work? Well, what do you mean work? Well, what do you think ministry is? Robert Salerden, who will be here at the end of the month and the beginning of next month. We heard a CD of him. He had to fire so many people off of his staff 3 weeks ago. You know why? Because they didn't believe ministry was work. They just came and sat in the office and did nothing. And he said, what do you think you're here for? He said, I fired them. So I told them, get out. Ministry is work. It's work. And it's work among the people. The tenderness of ministry. Number 3 characteristic Paul talks about here. Verse 7. Even as a nurse. Even as a nurse. There's a time for discipline. There's a time for being stern. There's a time to really truly be and not give. But there has to be a tenderness also. There has to be a balance in this ministry. You have to know when to use what. And a lot of times we don't. Even in children, we mess up. We try to, because all the kids come from all the same parents, we figure we can treat them all the same. And guess what? You can't. They're all different. You have to handle everything differently. You can't. Amber's like me. And when Amber, I handle Amber different. I've learned. Amber's like me. Slap her upside the head and lay it out on the line. No candy coat, nothing. No do nothing, just lay it out. This is the way it is. Black or white. Now you choose. I can't do that to Mercy. Mercy's the exact opposite. Mercy, and Mercy got 4 kids, and 2 are like Amber, and 2 are like Mercy. They're just sensitive. You can't raise your voice at them. They think you're yelling at them. They think you hate them. And so Paul says that a nurse, that there has to be a tenderness. Now we're going to get to Paul as a father, but we think of a nursing mother, the tenderness that she ministers to her children. She knows when to hold them and cuddle them and keep them close. And so Paul says you got to have this aspect of a ministry. It's not all fire and brimstone. There are times when you got to be tender. Next thing Paul says, that the nurturing aspect of a ministry. There is a nurturing aspect of a ministry. Cherisheth it. You know what nurture? It means there's got to be an aspect of ministry that takes somebody from a baby to an adult. And everything in between. Because everybody comes into the ministry as a baby. And you got to take them from a baby that desires milk of the word to one that can eat the meat of the word. And you got to be able to nurture them. You got to be able to bring them along. You got to be able to show them how to go from stage to stage to stage to stage. And if you don't, you will fail. You will fail. Because there's this nurturing aspect of every ministry. We have to know how to bring people along. Pastor Gary used to say it this way, and it is so true. If you're leading and nobody's following, you're just taking a walk. You're just taking a walk. Because a leader has followers. Remember what Paul said. You first were followers. Then you were ministers. We start as followers. And we need to know how to bring them along every step of the way. Next one. The relationship of ministry. Children. We have to see everybody as children. As family. I heard Dr. Jeremiah on Thursday talk about people, and he was talking, and he was going through Count It All Joy. He's going through his commentary on the book of Philippians. And he said, look out, you people that think you don't belong anywhere. He said, look how many brothers and sisters you have. Look how many brothers and sisters. And Paul says that ministry looks at people as children. And we never did, and we will get to eventually. We'll get to the virtuous woman. And one aspect of the virtuous woman, the church of the last day, is that she knows how to birth children. See, so much in the church today, we're not birthing children. We're stealing fish. We just steal sheep. And we have fish that hop tanks. But the ministry is birthing of children. And the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31 was a woman who knew how to birth children. She wasn't stealing other people's children. She was birthing her own children and bringing them along until at the end of her life, all her children calls her blessed. Why? Because she imparted into their lives. We're going to get to it in just down here a little bit. But if ministry in this church isn't imparting anything into your life, then why are you here? Why are you here? If you're watching something on TV and you come away and you think, oh, that was a wasted hour, then why are you listening to it? If there is no impartation, every ministry will impart something into your life. You may not like it. We talk about Karen, and we talk about Robert Morris, who makes you laugh for about 20 minutes, and then all of a sudden he slaps you on the side of the head, and you feel absolutely like, where can I crawl? Give me a rock to crawl under, because he just exposed everything that's wrong in your life. I call him a sneaky preacher. He's sneaky. Then you got Justin Franklin, who just stands up there. And I'll tell you, if you ever watch Justin Franklin, if he's in a suit, you're in trouble. Because he said, look, I even wore a suit today. Because what I'm going to tell you, you're not going to like. But you're going to at least say, man, he looked good. And I'm telling you right now, every time we watch Justin Franklin and he's in a suit, it's like, where can I hide? Because he just lays it right out. You know who else lays it right out? Michael Youssef. Michael Youssef pulls no punches. He pulls no punches. Oh, and if you want his new journal, his monthly devotion, he pulls apart the prosperity gospel of today. He shreds it based on biblical truth and what it has done to the church. He pulls no punches. You see people sitting in this church, when they pan the audience, they're crying, they're putting their head down, they're going like this. Because he knows when to do it, and then there's other times. Okay, but so we got that. The relationship. He treats them as children, and that's what ministry does. Children. That special relationship that we have. Paul says this. Paul looked at the churches of Thessalonians as children. You are my children. I birthed you into the ministry. I brought you forth. And then Paul told the Galatians, of whom I travail again. I birthed you, but now I have to travail again so that Christ would be formed in you. Yeah, you were birthed into the kingdom, but we got to go higher. It's not enough just to be saved. Now I got to birth, and I got to pray again until Christ becomes formed in you. Next, F, the passion of ministry. Being affectionately desirous of you. Verse 8, being affectionately desirous of you. Ministry ought to have a passion. There ought to be a passion that drives you. Paul had a passion to see this church succeed. Even when he wasn't there, he had a passion for them. Watching Dr. Jeremiah talk about Paul. Paul was in prison, and his most favorite church was the third church at the Philippi. And he had a passion for those people. Even in the midst of what he was going through, he was affectionate to that church. He had a drawing to that church. He had a connection to that church. Pastor Gary used to say this, and it's so true. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And Paul said this, every ministry has to have a passion to connect with people. To connect with people. Paul said, well, let me see. He said this, so being affectionately desirous of you. So being affectionately desirous of you. Let me just, Paul said, it says simply this, to have a fond affection, to long for someone passionately and earnestly, and have a deep concern that compels them to reach out to other people. That's what ministry is all about. That's what it's all about. G, the determination of ministry. Found in the words, we are willing. Being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing. It means my mind has been made up before I ever started that no matter what it takes, no matter how long it takes, no matter what the sacrifice is, I'm willing to take it. See, we want ministry on our terms. We want ministry to fit into our schedule. No, you have to have a determination that it's not going to fit into your schedule all the time. God's going to ask you to do things when it's not convenient. And he's not waiting to hear, not now, Lord, how about I'll get it later. No, when he tells you to do something, you do it. And you've got to have that mind made up before you ever even enter in, that no matter what it takes. Paul said we were willing. We already made up our mind. When we came to Thessalonica, that no matter what it would take, we were going to do it in order to be successful. No matter what it took. Our mind was already made up. Our mind was already made up. Paul said, even if you don't pay us, even if you don't give us any money, even if you don't support the ministry, it doesn't matter. Our mind is made up. We're going to do whatever it takes. And what did it take? Well, we'll get down to it a little bit later because it's in verse 9. Paul said, we worked day and night so that we weren't chargeable to you. Because it was a poor church. Why? Because they lived in a city that when you accepted Jesus Christ, you lost your job. You lost your life, mostly. You lost your house. You lost your possessions. And Paul said, that's okay. Because we already made up our mind that no matter what it takes, we're going to do it. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. The climax of every ministry, that's the next characteristic. The climax of every ministry is the very next phrase. To have imparted unto you. Every ministry, every time somebody speaks, there needs to be an impartation into your life. A word that you never saw before. A word that you never understood before. Paul says, I'm going to leave you with an impartation. I'm going to impart something into your life. Can you imagine a church service in Thessalonica that every time they gathered, there was an impartation into their lives that changed their lives? They just didn't sit there for an hour and go away thinking, well, that was a wasted hour. No, Paul said, I'm going to impart something into you. A lot of times, if laying on of hands, Paul said, by the laying on of hands, there was an impartation of spiritual gifts. There was an impartation of a now word for your situation, what you're going through. There was an impartation of comfort. Well, we'll get to that next time. But well, I'll just read it to you. That you were exhorted, you were comforted, you were charged. That's an impartation. And Paul says, there has to be. This is the climax of all ministry. What are we imparting into your life? If we're not imparting anything into your life, why are we doing anything? Let's go home and sit in front of the TV and do nothing. Why are you coming here? Has to be an impartation. You may not like it, but I like what Smith Wigglesworth used to say. He said, I'll either make you glad or mad, but I'll make you something. You will not be the same. There will be an impartation into your life. And how you receive that impartation determines what you get out of that impartation. The vehicle of every ministry, this is the vehicle. Every ministry has a vehicle. The gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the vehicle. That's the message. That's the message. That's the vehicle. That's what we're peddling. That's what we're bringing out there. That's what we're sharing. It's the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's all we have. We have nothing else. We have nothing else. That's our vehicle. We're not telling cute stories. We're not reading poems. I was somewhere one time and someone said, we got a new pastor. I said, oh, great. How is he? He tells good stories. Okay. If that's what you want, a storyteller. I don't want a storyteller. I want someone who's going to preach the gospel. That's the vehicle. The vehicle to minister to people is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Because God said, I confirm the word. I confirm the word. Methods change. Methods change. We talked about it just a couple weeks ago. That Oral Roberts and Billy Graham, they started their ministry in tents, but they recognized that this thing that was coming into people's homes that they called the church, called the television, was a means to reach a world with the gospel of Jesus Christ. They knew how to change from tents to television. And God has taught us through COVID how to go from tents to television to everything out there. Your phone, not my phone, but your phone. The internet, the tablet, all that stuff. That you could watch ministry everywhere you go. Everywhere you go. J, the sacrifice of ministry. Look what Paul says. Not the gospel only, but our own souls. I'm not only going to preach to you, but I'm going to impart something of myself to you. I'm going to impart something of myself. Ministry is a sacrifice. And if you're not willing to sacrifice, you don't have a ministry. It's going to cost you something. And Paul says we were willing. Well, determination. See, Paul said, I'm already willing, no matter what it costs. It's going to cost me time. It's going to cost me energy. It's going to cost me work. It's going to cost me travail. It may cost me my life. It's definitely going to cost part of me as I pour it into you. But Paul says, I'm willing to pay that price. I'm willing to be expended for the gospel of Jesus Christ. I'm willing to lay down my life for the gospel of Jesus Christ. If that's what it takes, Paul says, I'm willing to do that. My team is willing to do that. Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. The sacrifice. Are you willing to do whatever it takes? You see, we see ministries. We see, we see Robert Morris on television, and we see him standing there. We see Pastor Jim. Saw him yesterday down at thing. He never knew how big he was until he saw him, how tall he is. But, we look at that ministry and we look at how far it's grown in 20 years to over 39,000 members, how many campuses this has that watch it all at the same time in various campuses around Dallas, Fort Worth, that whole entire area. And we look at that and say, wow, yeah, but are you willing to pay the price to get there? You see, like Pastor Gary used to say, you see this now. But you don't see the price that had to be paid to get to this. As Pastor Jim, with Robert Slater will be here, and God's generals, and how some of those people in the early days, especially the women in the early days of ministry, had to clean out barns themselves, set up chairs. He talked about Lester Summerall. And Lester Summerall preached, and he said that he started out with 8 people, and more people came because it was told that he was the best liar that they ever heard. That they ought to come and just hear this liar. He can tell a story and turn a yarn like nobody else's business. And he got crowds because became known as a liar, because his testimony was so phenomenal. And we got to be willing to pay the price. You know, at the end, how many ministries and all the things, but sacrifice. Are you willing to pay it? Are you willing to pay it? Getting up early, staying up late. Pastor Jim on call, Pastor Gary on call, all hours of the day, all hours of the night, no matter where. How many times Pastor Gary had to go to Baltimore, to the hospital in Baltimore, have Pastor Jim and Pastor Gary drove to Pittsburgh, Danville, Cleveland Clinic. Well, I can't go today. I got a golf game today. No, you don't. It's a sacrifice. Are you going to pay it? All right, let's go. Let's finish. The requirement of every ministry is this: you were dear unto us. Got to have a place in my heart. You have to have a place in our heart. That's the requirement of ministry. You got to love people. If you don't love people, what are you doing? Because ministry is people. And Paul says you were dear to us. That's the requirement of every ministry. Why was Paul's ministry successful? Because he loved people. You show me a ministry that loves people, and I'll show you a ministry that is successful. Paul's commentaries said that the success of every ministry depends upon how much they love people. And not that they tell people they love them. Because Paul says, you saw. They show people that they love them. They show people they love them. L, verse 9. The example of ministry. You remember. Paul lived there. He said, you remember. I'm an example. Every ministry ought to be an example. Every ministry. Is every ministry perfect? No. Does every ministry make mistakes? Yeah. Why? Because we're all the same. We're flawed. But Paul says, you're an example. You know what we're all about. M is the work of the ministry, labor. Paul said, we labor. We labor. Work. But not only that, the intensity of ministry is travail. There's a breaking of the soul. It's a breaking of the heart for people. I can't tell you how many times at the end of the service we'd go back in the office when Pastor Gary was here and he'd be crying at his desk. Why? Because he knew God was dealing with people out there, and you know what they were doing? Sitting right there as if God wasn't touching them. And he did all that he could do. The Holy Ghost did all that he could do, and there they were. And he'd have to go back in that office, and he'd cry and head on his desk, weeping because the travail of his soul, knowing that he did his part, his labor, God did his part by convicting them, and they refused to do anything to respond to what God was doing. Not knowing if this week, if that may have been their last chance. The intensity of ministry is travail. Can I tell you what? The unselfishness of ministry. The unselfishness of ministry. Paul says this as we close. We would not. We would not. Paul said, I don't want anybody to owe me anything. Because I don't want anybody to come and say, because we gave you this. Now you're obligated. Remember Pollyanna? Remember the movie Pollyanna? And how Pollyanna's aunt would tell the preacher what to preach? Because he was obligated, because it was her finances that paid for everything that was in the church. How about the bishop's wife? The bishop's wife that there were people in the ministry that were paying for paying the ministry, and so they were determining what was taking place in the church. Paul says, "No, not in my ministry. Nah. My ministry is not going to be chargeable to any of you. I'm going to be answerable to one person, God. It's going to be an unselfish ministry." And the last thing, the purpose of every ministry: preach. Preach, 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 and when you're done, preach. And now we're going to get into what Pastor Jim talked about next week. Pray, pray, pray. Because that's where it starts. But Paul was able to exhort. Paul was able to comfort. Paul was able to charge because he knew how to pray, pray, pray. He knew the beginning. He knew the beginning of ministry. But that's the ministry of gentleness, which we cannot neglect. But we need the ministry of a father too. And the father is the one who sets things right. The father is the one that corrects. We're going to look at that aspect of the ministry too next week. And then verse 13, the week after, is our response to those types of ministry. Because if we don't respond to those ministries, who cares? We have to have a right response. You see, everybody thought that Cornelius did a great job. Yeah, Cornelius did a great job, or Peter did a great job, but Peter's success was due in part to the heart of Cornelius and the people that came to hear him. Amen. Well, we'll continue next week. The ministry of training. Thank you.
Thank you.